Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and RIP Machinima. Before I start this, one thing I want to say is if you're unaware, I have a Discord now. It's completely free for people to join. The link's in the description. Come on in, hang out with everybody. So getting on with the video, I received a package. This package comes from Castlemania Games, and full disclosure, they sent this to me absolutely for free for the purposes of review. So if you want to check anything out at Castlemania Games, a link as well to that will be in the description. Very much appreciate it. Ryan's an awesome guy. So let's open this up first, and then we'll get talking. So cut the box back here, and then cut through the top. And inside, we've got a few different things. Okay, put the box away. First things up, which is not really, it's just kind of a bonus, but let me get it out here. There they are. This is completely unrelated to the video, but I thought it'd be cool to show you guys anyway. When I was at PAX West quite some time ago, I was cool enough to get to hang out with Ryan. Thank you, Ryan. But also I went to the Bethesda special party that they had going on down there, and they were giving out free bottles of Nuka-Cola Quantum, but I had no way to bring it back because I didn't have a bag to check, and so Ryan held on to it for me, and he just said he'd mail it to me next time he had something to send me. So that was awesome of him to do, so thank you very much, Ryan. But let me put those away. Now, why we're here is this package, this much smaller, neat little package. Now, what this is the GCHD MK2. Now, doesn't sound very appealing, but it actually really is. What I have next to it right here is the GCHD. I guess we now call it the MK1. So in short, what this is, as you can tell, this is about the Nintendo GameCube. What we have here is a device that, in short, all you do is you plug it into the back of your GameCube, and bada bing, bada boom, you can play your GameCube with HDMI and have a much better picture. That's the idea. Now, I actually did a full review of the GCHD originally, and my general assessment was that it was a quality product, but it was a little expensive considering what you're getting, but it was still ultimately a good device that gave you solid picture quality. Now, the GCH2, which I obviously have not used yet, although I have read a lot about it, I've talked to the guys at Eon, I've talked to, obviously, Ryan at Castlemania Games, and the general assessment is they didn't change the price point, but they decided to give you more bang for your buck. As in, this thing performs the same as the original model. The video quality differences are non-existent. They use the exact same firmware, they didn't change anything in that regard. So if you already have a GCHD, this is probably not going to be for you. However, if you don't have one, this might be up your alley. So I'm gonna go ahead and take a look at it, and we're gonna focus more specifically on what the changes are and the improvements, and I'm gonna kind of treat this almost like you've already seen the original video. But if you haven't, again, it's just a really cool product that gave you a solid video quality for your GameCube. But let's move on. Opening here, there's this neat little box. And, well, the first change, other than the color of the box, is, well, I guess it's basically the color of the box. They offered you three different options this time. There's a black one I have here, there's a silver one, and there's a purple one. And the logic behind that was, hey, have it match your North American style GameCube if you want to. So you open it up, just this cutesy little box, and you get some instructions that include things about how to plug it in and basics, setting information, all that kind of stuff. And then you get to the actual device, which is just this tiny little thing. And that's really all there is to it. Now, I specifically chose the black one, despite the irony that I have the Japanese Final Fantasy white crystal GameCube, which is not the same as the white European one. This one's incredibly hard to find. And then I have the Japanese Panasonic GameCube, which will be here for a specific purpose. But when you compare it to the original model, which I have here, they look obviously nearly identical. However, there are various changes, which is the focus of this particular video. Now, cosmetically, at least I have both black versions. I mean, obviously if you had a different color, that would be another thing, but cosmetically, the first thing you'll notice is MK2 is written on here as opposed to nothing. And then you have the port over here is a little bit different, which I'll explain in a minute. And then on the back, there's some additional ports that did not exist on the original model. But other than that, it's basically the same. So what are the additional changes? Well, first of all, let's talk about that extra port. Now, on the original model here, this extra port was only there to provide additional stability when you would plug it into the back of your GameCube. Now, I must note this for the record. If you're looking to get this thing and you're curious, like, hey, should I get it? First thing you need to know is you have to look at the back of your GameCube. You have to have an early model GameCube that has both ports. This is the AV port and the AV digital port. You need the AV digital port. The problem is Nintendo stripped these out of later iterations of the GameCube. So if your back of your GameCube only has one port back here, unfortunately you cannot use this device. But provided that you have both ports, then the idea was that you just take this and plug this in. Now, the original device only made use of the AV digital port. It actually didn't use the AV analog port for any purpose other than plastic being put in there just for stability. That's all it did. Now, there was a consequence for that I noticed and other people noticed as well in their reviews and discussions, which was the sound quality out of that thing was not as good as you would expect. There was something just a little bit off about it. However, in the new version, they fixed that. This is no longer just a dummy port. It actually has a purpose, which is to tap into the original sound of the GameCube. And that has a couple of additional benefits in it as well, and one negative. But let's talk about that one super tiny negative, because it's going to affect a handful of people at best, and I'm one of them. So this is the Panasonic GameCube. It was also known as the Q, or it actually was displayed as a Q. It was a strange thing, only came out in Japan, plays DVDs. I even have the official Game Boy player for it. It's crazy. But the back of it is not like the other GameCubes. It has a series of ports, but it also has the digital AV port. Now, obviously, you can't plug the new one in there because the analog port is not next to it. There is no analog port at all. It's just separated. It's through just composite output. So what that means is the new version of this cannot work on this device, no ifs, ands, or buts. The old one technically couldn't because the plastic thing was in its way. However, you could RGT85 this, I mean, Sean actually did this, just kind of saw off this little piece of plastic and then it would fit and it would actually work. So the only negative, as far as I can tell to the new model, is that there's no way to have it work on the Panasonic Q, whereas the old one could. But that affects a handful of people at best. I am one of them, but even I'm like, like, I have a million other ways to play the GameCube. This isn't even how I would play the GameCube, so kind of a non-factor. More of an interesting technical note. Or not even technical note, just a note. But moving on, there are positives to that. And this is why they did this, which is the audio quality is much better. And so here they added a couple of extra ports. One of them is a 3.5mm audio jack, which gives you the option to use things like headphones or connect it into your stereo system. It also supports mini toslink, so you can integrate it into your system if that's how you have things set up. So that's a cool bonus that can only exist now because of this, because it's tapping in properly to the audio. The other thing it has, which I personally would never use, but I do see why it's intriguing, is this port, which is actually a Wii component cable port. Now, what you can do with that is just, as it would suggest, you just plug that in and then you can use the Wii component cables on your GameCube. Now the reason that might be kind of interesting or people might care is what I have here is actually the official Nintendo GameCube component cables. This was, for the longest time, how you got the best video quality out of your GameCube. The problem with these is that they're prohibitively expensive. Nintendo did not make nearly enough of them. They really only got a wide release in Japan. They got a very limited, I think, online-only release in North America, and they never hit Europe or Australia, as far as I know. So they weren't practical to find. And because they didn't do very well, that's why Nintendo actually stripped the port out eventually. So it's good that people are actually now finding third-party solutions to actually solve this problem. But a lot of people over the years, the common response, and I know from making videos about it, the first but you would always get was, but couldn't I just play my GameCube games on a Wii and use the component cables? Yes, you could do that. And of course it would work, it's just not as good. Wii Component was just not as good at displaying as GameCube Component was. The games just didn't quite look as good. So what this offers you, if you want to do this, if your setup is infrastructured around Component, which mine is not, full disclosure, you now have the option, because all it's going to be doing is passing along the original component signal and then through the firmware that they have built into this thing, which once again is identical to this, which is why the HDMI output of these devices is identical. Nothing has changed as far as video quality between these two devices. The new one simply has additional features the old one did not. It's cool because if you really wanted to, that allows you to have dual output. You can now output through HDMI and through Component at the exact same time. So in practice, what that means is you can have one GameCube splitting its signal to 2 different TVs or monitors. Now, that may not have too much of a practical purpose, but there are a couple applications. Things where, I don't know, if you're playing competitive Smash or something like that, and each person wants their own TV, you can do that. Or if you're doing live streaming and the way you have your setup, your infrastructure set up, that would work as well. So that makes things like that a little bit easier. So the other thing that's cool about this, and I've praised things like the certain versions of the pound cable and so on for this, is that this is not even a change, it's just something I still give them credit for, is that the HDMI port is on board. It's not a hardwired cable. And the reason that's good is that it allows you to swap out the HDMI cable with any one of your choosing, whether you use a crappy generic one, a high-end regular one, or something fancy like the M cable, which I recommend wholeheartedly because the M cable and the GameCube go really well together. What it will do for it is amazing. I did a video on the M cable, but the super short version is it's a cable that has a processor in it that creates an anti-aliasing effect for older content. So when you stick 480p rendered games into it, it actually cleans them up, buffers them out a little bit, and makes them look even better. And I highly recommend it because I already know it works because I've done it with this and I've done it with my HDMI modified GameCube. I know it looks solid. So that's recommended. Now, a couple other technical notes here. One thing that's very important to know is that while this might all sound like, oh cool, then I just buy this and I'm done with GameCube, I don't have to worry about it anymore. Not that easy. Part of the problem is that the GameCube, only about half of its games supported progressive scan, which is basically the high resolution modes which you would need in order for this thing to really have much benefit. And the way you'll know, other than just finding a list online, is if you put a game in and you hold down B on the controller and just keep holding it, while this is inserted, you'll be prompted with a screen that says, do you want to put the game in progressive scan or not? Always say yes. If that screen never presents itself, then the game doesn't support progressive scan. Now, that in of itself is an issue, sort of, that this thing kind of solves for you. Now, if it can't support progressive scan, that means the game only supports 480i. Now, that wasn't that big of a deal when you were connecting it through composite or, even component through component-based monitors because they all understood that resolution. The problem is that a lot of TVs and monitors that run through HDMI, they are not designed to function with a 480i signal. In other words, a 480i signal coming through an HDMI port, a lot of the time you'll just get no display or some sort of error. Now this device, when they made this, they knew that. So there's a firmware setting in there called line doubling. There's a whole bunch of extra features on this thing that's on board the software, which I already talked about because they're not really any different. But some of them you don't really, I personally would never use, things like the scan line generator, I'd never care about that. But the line doubler is important because it basically generates an artificial 480p. It won't actually make the games look any better, but at least your television will understand it and you'll be able to play the game. And that, of course, is, on top of that, as I mentioned, the M cable. If you're using native 480p rendered content within the GameCube, the M cable will do even more to clean it up. If you're using 480i artificially upscaled to 480p, the M cable won't do that much with it. So what you want to do to really get the most out of it is to, have this and have the M cable and have, progressive scan compatible games. But you're talking expensive. Like, that's an expensive setup. And that's really the downside to this particular device. Is at the end of the day, it is still $150, just as much as this one was. The only difference really is, again, it's got some extra features to make it nicer and better. I know it's already solid though, because like I said, they haven't changed anything as far as the picture output. So I'm curious what people like Pound or some of these other companies are going to put out to compete with this. Because when it comes to that generation, it seems like it's like there's one group doing really high-end GameCube stuff and no low-end GameCube stuff, and then everyone else is doing like low-end Xbox, sort of Dreamcast, PS2, and no high-end versions of those. I'm just kind of waiting for them to cross paths. So I've been using this thing for a little while, and it's time for final thoughts. Now, honestly, not a whole lot has changed. There's not much I really need to say here, but there's a couple little points that I want to acknowledge. First and foremost is kind of a little cleanup to earlier part of the video, in which I said that the device has a menu on board so that you can change things like scan lines or the line doubler, etc. While that is true, it does have that, I underestimated how easy or not easy that would actually be. Because I'm used to an HDMI modified GameCube, and on that particular GameCube, which is not on this table, all you have to do is press a couple of different buttons and the menu prompts and you can change whatever you want. This does not offer that option. What you have to do is get a universal remote and then program it via the IR blaster to the device, which is not a particularly difficult task. It's just something that needs to be done. It even includes directions on how to do that in the box. But I didn't have a spare one laying around, and I wasn't about to go out and buy one when it's not a feature I'm really going to need, because the default settings are what I already want them to be. But be aware that you would need that. Now, in the event that you do want to change it and you're fine with the universal remote, that's all good. But be aware of one other random issue I ran into, and it was, I think it was more on my end than it's anything anybody else is going to run into, but this was what happened. So I had the GameCube, and I had the device, and I had it set up via the Wii component cables. Plugged it into my primary TV, no problem. Plugged it in a couple of others, no problem. But one TV in particular didn't like it, and I'll show you. This is what it looked like. I would turn it on, and it would just kind of flicker. You see how that goes? Now, if you play long enough and the game supports progressive scan, then enable the progressive scan and the issue goes away. There's something about that television, at least, that did not like the whole concept of line doubling. I don't know why. I don't know if it's something about that TV specifically, or if there's other TVs out there that do that. I honestly don't know, but be aware of that vague possibility. But I haven't heard anyone else talk about this particular issue, so I get the feeling it's pretty niche, and it's probably not something most people would ever really likely to run into. But be aware of that. Now, that's not that big of a deal if you're playing a progressive scan game, because yeah, you can deal with a little bit of flickering for a minute, hold down B, and then as soon as progressive scan's enabled, you don't have the problem anymore. However, if the game doesn't support progressive scan, which is about half of the GameCube library, then in that scenario, you really couldn't play the game. But again, I don't want this to sound like this is something that's actually stopping you from buying this or checking this out, because that's very unlikely to be a problem for really anyone out there. I was amazed I had one TV that even did that. But just be aware, just being honest, being fair. As far as like other little changes, the only other thing I really noticed was that if you plugged it into the GameCube versus the old model required a hell of a lot of force to get in there. Like so much so that it felt like you were breaking it and you still had to go further until you heard this click, snap, whatever. And until you heard that, no matter how hard you thought the thing was in, it was not going to work. This one, they've reduced that a bit. It doesn't require nearly as much pressure to get in there. That said, it still requires to be pretty precise. There were times where I thought it was in and it wasn't working, but then I pushed in a little further and there it went. Also keep in mind that the red E in the center lights up and illuminates when it's powered correctly, so that should also help in that scenario. But there were times where I had it partially plugged in, the light would go on and then still get no signal until I kind of realized, oh, I have to click it just a little bit harder. So just be aware. It's not like, we're not talking like this is actually difficult. Just be aware that it might require a little more finesse than you might expect. So there's that. And the only downside over the previous model, like literally the only one, is since this thing was dummy plastic originally, you know, you could shave it and technically it would work on this model of the GameCube. But other than that, which doesn't really affect anybody other than me, is just such a non-factor. So then when you talk about the new features, like how do a lot of those pan out? Well, the one I obviously wanted to focus on the most was the Wii component cables. So let's talk about that right now. Now, for this, I decided to test, because everybody's talking about Resident Evil a lot lately, I decided to test Resident Evil 4 with various quality options. I know what you're thinking, hey, Resident Evil 2 is on the GameCube, why don't you use that? We're all talking about it because Resident Evil 2. Well, Resident Evil 2 on the GameCube doesn't support progressive scan, even though the Dreamcast version does. I don't know why, but that's just how it was done. Anyway, so, taking a look at Resident Evil 4. This is Resident Evil 4 running on the Nintendo GameCube stock hardware, running with the official Nintendo brand component cables. This is what Nintendo gave you and said, this is the best you are going to get from us. Now keep in mind, even though I didn't do direct comparisons here, this is better than what it would look like on an actual Wii. I didn't compare that here, but this is what it's supposed to look like. That's the point. This is what the Nintendo GameCube specifically is supposed to have its progressive scan games look like. Now, I'm very pleased to report that when you use this device, the GCHD 2, and you connect it via the Wii component cables, this is the result. To be honest, I can't tell any difference. I really can't. And that makes me actually very happy, because I've said this in the past in other videos. When the company who invents the thing says this is what it should look like, the third-party options shouldn't look worse. I'm not saying they always have to look better, but they should at least be on par. They don't need to introduce errors that weren't there originally. And fortunately, that seems to be the case in this situation, where Eon decided, hey, we're going to make a product that actually does what we said it was going to do. And I'm happy about that. So if you are in the market for GameCube Component, this is probably a much better option for you, because not only do you get the component signal at a cheaper price, you also get the HDMI future-proofing. So speaking of that, let's move on. This is what it looks like running in HDMI. Now this is how most people, I think, who buy this device would actually use it. And that's awesome. That's how I would use it. Now keep in mind, this has not changed at all, not one iota from the original version as far as picture quality goes. But it's just to make the point that for most people who aren't, running these things via component or doing some sort of like, aren't focused on using it on things like PVMs or in competitive tournaments or on CRTs with some component, like the majority of people, I think, who are going to buy this are looking to play it on a modern television in their modern setup. This is the result you are typically going to get, and I think that that's a pretty solid experience. That said, why not try to go a little bit higher? So what I did is I threw in the M cable, which I've talked about many times, but once again, the very brief description of what it is it's a high-end HDMI cable that includes an anti-aliasing processor in it. And really, at the end of the day, what it does is it just kind of buffs out the image so that it looks cleaner. Almost not like a half-generation upgrade, but like, I don't know, a quarter generation upgrade. It just looks cleaner. It just looks like a nicer image. And in this case, it certainly does. It's smoothed out a lot of the edges. And it's in my opinion, this is how I use the GameCube. I use my HDMI modified GameCube with the M cable to give me that experience. And I love it. I think it's fantastic. Keep in mind that, of course, these are all scenarios where games support progressive scan, and only about 50% of GameCube games actually support progressive scan. If I had used Resident Evil 2 for this particular demo, you would not be getting nearly as interesting of results because it does not support it. So while it would technically work and it would display and you'd be able to play it, unless of course you have a weird TV like I did in that one scenario, you wouldn't really get that nearly as much of an upgrade out of it. So you got to keep that in mind. But just for shits and giggles, I also decided to do this. This is Resident Evil 4 running via composite. The yellow, red, and white cables that they gave you with the console. You can really improve these things, man. A lot of that stuff is on board. It's ready to go. It's in there. You can have such a better, higher quality gaming experience if you want to do that. And fortunately, that option now exists to you. So once again, composite, and then you've got the M cable. You see what I'm saying? Like, you can just a couple little devices and bam, look what it looks like. I know what you're thinking. How's the lag? Is that a problem? No, I mean, this thing was engineered by gamers who designed it specifically for the GameCube. They made a high-end product, and I certainly never ran into any issues like that. Same even with things like the M cable, which actually reduces. It actually runs faster than your average HDMI cable. So it's just, I never ran into these kinds of problems. So I'm thrilled about that. And at the end of the day, man, I can say that I recommend the GCHD 2 if, and this is the big if you don't have the GCHD 1 or you don't have the official Nintendo component cables. Because if you don't, then this is potentially a justifiable increase because it's expensive, and let's keep it real about that. But it's still a very solid product, and on those grounds, I can definitely recommend it. But if you already have the GCHD 1, it's entirely up to you if you feel it's worth it to you to upgrade for those additional features. If you do have it, it's really the only reason to would be if you really love the idea of playing the GameCube via component. For whatever reason, or at least very easily being able to split the monitor. And fun little fact, because I tested this too, I connected my HDMI modified GameCube with this thing, and because that has its own separate output, and this thing supports dual output, I actually got the same video signal out 3 times on the same device. Which I thought it was pointless, but it was cool. But actually, it did make recording a little bit easier. That was nice. But anyway, so yeah, that's it. If you're interested in it, please feel free to check out the link in the description to Castlemania Games. Thanks again to them for providing this. Ryan, you're an awesome dude. And of course, check out my Discord. Again, link in the description, completely free. Join. And thank you very much for watching. I'll see you all later.